Up to now, our series on lightsaber forms has covered the more basic forms. We've talked about the basics of Shicho, the dual focus Mukashi, and the strictly defensive Surisu. But today, we're going to be moving on to the more complicated forms. Form 4, or Ataru, is best known as the preferred form of Jedi Master Yoda, who used it in combination with the Force to devastating effect. But despite its use by the Jedi Order's most well-known master, Ataru had a dark side to it, as we'll discuss in this video.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
In the same way Mukashi was developed as a counter to Shicho, you can think of Ataru as a counter to Surisu. While Surisu focused on defense and presented no real offensive capabilities, Ataru was overwhelmingly offensive. Unlike the three prior forms, its aim was to overwhelm an opponent, usually through sheer momentum. It encouraged practitioners to fight aggressively, to strike from as many angles as possible and quickly wear an opponent out. In this, it relied more than any other form on the use of the Force, which allowed Jedi to use acrobatics to further overwhelm targets. It's not known when or why Form 4 developed. Unlike Mukashi or Surisu, it didn't seem to have been conceived in response to any specific historical pressures. Like Mukashi, it struggled against multiple enemies and blaster-wielding opponents, but unlike Mukashi, it wasn't specifically tailored for lightsaber duels either. It's possible that Ataru developed sometime around the Great Hyperspace War, in which the Jedi came up against Sith who primarily used alchemically enhanced swords, but that's speculative and seems unlikely, as it would mean the remaining lightsaber forms were developed in a much shorter window than their predecessors. Regardless, we would guess that it was developed for use against opponents who fought like Sith of the era, judging by the strengths of the form. The popularity of Ataru waxed and waned, but not as regularly as some of the other forms. During some wars, it was popular among Jedi fighting on the front lines. This was especially true during the Mandalorian Wars, in which the Revanchists used the form to great effect against Mandalorian warriors. During other wars, however, use of the form was discouraged, as it was feared that Ataru's aggression would lead its users to the dark side. Ataru wasn't taught to younger Jedi during the New Sith Wars for this same reason. After the end of the New Sith Wars, it became more popular again, and by the time of the Clone Wars, it was actually a favorite of Padawans and young Jedi Knights, contrary to how the Order had treated it a millennium earlier.
This technique is good against a lone opponent, and you will find your critical strikes are more effective, but you will be vulnerable to almost everyone else you are fighting.
Ataru was known as the aggression form or way of the Hawkbat, as its practitioners seemed to mimic the furious, unpredictable attack patterns of those vicious creatures. In fact, one of Ataru's signature maneuvers was named after the Hawkbat swoop, in which the practitioner would deliver a quick strike and then maneuver away before their opponent had a chance to respond. Ataru generally favored those sorts of maneuvers, taking a sort of quantity over quality approach to offense. Form 4 practitioners often didn't strike that hard, but they did strike dizzyingly fast and from every which way. As we mentioned earlier, Ataru was designed to make use of the Force. This was hardly something unique to Ataru. As we mentioned when we talked about Surisu, that form was also heavily reliant on the Force. However, Ataru differed from the other forms in that its practitioners didn't necessarily use the Force for greater clarity or to center themselves. Instead, they used it to enhance their physical capabilities. The most obvious aspect of this was the acrobatics that Ataru masters worked into combat. But Form 4 users drew on the Force in more subtle ways as well. Ataru practitioners called on the Force to make themselves faster, stronger, and more perceptive, all means of overcoming their physical limitations. For this reason, Ataru was often used by Jedi that had greater physical limitations than their peers, including Jedi who were old, small, or in the case of Yoda, both. Ataru emphasized constant movement of the body. In particular, its moves often involved spinning, somersaults, and cartwheels, which, when combined with fast-paced lightsaber strikes, made Form 4 practitioners extremely hard to pin down. These acrobatic movements were involved primarily in offense, intended to keep opponents off balance, but they were useful in defense as well. Ataru, while an aggressive style, was not without defensive capabilities. However, unlike other forms, it taught its users to focus more on physically avoiding opponents' weapons instead of parrying them. This could prove to be a significant weakness if Ataru users found themselves fighting in tight spaces. Even Qui-Gon Jinn, an Ataru master, was easily outmaneuvered and struck down by Darth Maul once forced into a tight space. Ataru's strength, relative to other forms, was its flexibility. While the older forms emphasized careful footwork and straightforward movements, Form 4 encouraged practitioners to maintain constant motion, preferably in unpredictable ways. Ataru was at its best against single opponents in open spaces where the duelist had room to maneuver. It was an effective form for lightsaber duels, and while it struggled against the precision of Makashi, it was much more effective against strength-based combat techniques. As we mentioned when we discussed Makashi, the form didn't do well against strong opponents due to the light strikes inherent to the style. Ataru, on the other hand, was very effective against brute force, as its maneuverability allowed practitioners to run circles around strength-focused opponents while dishing out blows that were just as devastating. So what were the philosophical fundamentals of Ataru? To find our answer, we're going to briefly discuss the form's most well-known user, Master Yoda. With and without his lightsaber, Yoda always used Ataru to the fullest in combat. Even though he was normally a very stoic and peaceful being, when there was fighting to be done, he fought with all the ferocity of a coked-up house cat battling a raccoon, a contrast that some folks have argued ruins his character. But Ataru, while aggressive, wasn't in conflict with Yoda's usual peaceful ways. When we discussed Makashi, we mentioned that there was a difference between aggressive combat and a state of aggression, and the same thing applies here. Ataru, for Yoda, was a last resort. He always tried to avoid combat if possible, and he only pulled out his lightsaber when that ceased to be an option. Yoda made use of Ataru because, if there was fighting to be done, he wanted it to end as quickly as possible. Ataru was a lot like Makashi in that regard. Its aggressive maneuvers weren't necessarily an expression of the user's aggression, but rather a way to quickly and efficiently end combat. Ataru sought this goal in a different way, however. While Makashi relied on precision, Ataru masters relied on the strongest weapon they had in their arsenal, the Force. Ataru, at its most pure, was completely reliant on the Force, with practitioners using it to guide and enhance their every move. There was a bit of danger in this, however. Unlike Makashi, which required a sort of stoic calm, Ataru lended itself very well to powerful, aggressive emotions. It was far more open to the dark side than any of the three previous forms, as its offensive focus and wild maneuvers could be extremely effective when paired with the uncontrolled passion of Darksiders. If Ataru practitioners weren't careful, Form 4 could potentially even lead them to the dark side, encouraging them to surrender to aggression and pour their anger and hate into their strikes. This risk wasn't as pronounced as it was for some other forms, and the dark side was by no means inherent to Ataru, but the danger remained. So that's our look at Ataru, the fourth lightsaber combat form. Next week, we'll talk about Xian and Jiamso, the two styles of Form 5. But for now, what do you think? How much ketamine do you think Yoda needed to pull off all those sick moves? Feel free to post your thoughts in the comments section below, and as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.